So the first day we talked a little bit about education. We talked about 3 principles, and we did a little review on this before. Do any of you remember the 3 principles of education that we kind of base our thinking of education on? Why we choose what we choose. What was one of them?
Student becomes like the master.
Student becomes like the master.
What you feed will grow.
What you feed will grow. Responsibility.
Parents responsible.
The parents are responsible. Thank you very much. And do you remember what our definition of education was? What is the definition of education? Passing on, oops, there I go. Passing on the values of one generation to the next generation. That's the best definition of education that I've ever come across. And what do we have of value to pass on? Something to think about. It's an interesting thing to think about. And in what I really was impressed with the thought, a couple days ago, Richie was talking about your children becoming more and better than you. And the goal of generations to come being closer to God than we ourselves are. I really like that thought. Now, what of value do we have to pass on? How do we know what's valuable and what's not valuable? When I was growing up, my dad is a collector of things. He still is a collector of things. I am a collector of things. I see value in nearly everything that I come across, and I accumulate more and more things. And most of them are junk, but they have value to me. Well, we have business things happening here and there, and in one of the buildings where we do work, my dad has accumulated just vast amounts of stuff. And the shelves are full, and it's things like old hydraulic cylinders that may or may not work. They should be repacked. Air valves that could be rebuilt and may possibly work. Lasers that were bought cheaply at an auction that worked when they were taken out. And just shelves and shelves and shelves and shelves of things like that. Well, one day it was maybe when I was 16 or 17 in the time of my life when I was trying to help my dad become all that he could be, and be that force in his life to help him. I decided the place needed cleaned. We had a dumpster and a forklift and pallets. We just into the dumpster, into the dumpster, into the dumpster. And the place got a little cleaner. Of course, I wasn't addressing my own junk. It was my dad's junk I was addressing. And my junk I knew the value. I knew what it was for. I knew where it worked, and it was very valuable. We kept those shelves full. But my dad's junk needed to go. Well, I threw away a lot of things and I threw everything away that I didn't know what it was for. It was a good system. There was a set of wrenches, the weirdest wrenches you've ever seen, heavy. Each one weighed about 2 pounds probably. They had the open end of the wrench on one side, pretty good size, made of really thick metal, and then the handle got really fat, about this fat, round, and tapered off to a point, like a marlin spike. And I thought, this must be something from the 30s. I mean, people don't use wrenches like this. What do you even do? It's too thick to use on bolts. What could you possibly use a wrench like this? Into the dumpster they went. Well, years later, I'm about 25, 26, and I decided to put up a little shop. Steel building, and you're lining up all these beams with the purlins and the Z-bar and all that stuff, and you have metal beams and you have more metal beams that are supposed to fit together, and you're supposed to line up the holes where the bolts go through and drop them in. Well, what you really need is a wrench with a nice fat handle that tapers down to a point like a marlin spike to slip in that hole, wiggle it around, and lines your building right up. And lo and behold, my dad pulls out a set of these wrenches. I'm like, Dad, where'd you get those wrenches? He said, well, they were in the dumpster back in Plymouth. And I routinely go through the dumpster just in case there's something good in there. And there were all these wrenches. Do you have any idea who threw these wrenches in the dumpster? Well, that's a good question. There's a lot of people back there involved in those days. That's a good question. Who knows? Who knows who it was? Those wrenches had tremendous value. They helped us build that building easily and quickly. They have a name, which is slipping my mind right now. They were exactly what I needed later. Our parents give us things, possessions, but also traditions that sometimes are hard to see. Hard to see the value for. They meant something to Dad or Grandpa or whoever it was that kind of started a tradition. Interestingly enough, the old guys that were living 100 years ago that kind of started a lot of the traditions that we do today were not stupid. They were not sub-intelligent. Their knuckles were not dragging on the ground. They thought, they considered, and they said, we should do it this way. Because in doing it this way, there's value, there's safety, there's value for future generations. They valued it enough that they took the energy, took the work, took the time to pass on the tradition to somebody else. Now, one of my acquaintances, a doctor in Africa, his name is Tom, Dr. Tom. I don't even ever heard his last name. He's about 6 feet tall, and he's very hard to understand. He talks like that, and but he is an incredibly wise man. He's a smart man, but he's a wise man, and he grew up in Africa from when he was a very small boy, and he came over here and became a doctor, and has been a tremendously effective doctor in Africa, especially because he looks at things a little differently than most human beings that I know. If he would be tested, I'm sure there'd be a number of letters behind his name, and his teachers probably had struggles with him in school, but he's full of God. And he told me this story. He said he'd been living over in a little village in Africa, and I'm not sure where it was, but it was in one of the steamy, jungly parts of Africa, where they have a wet season and a dry season. And all the little houses in the village were round, and they were made of mud, and they had grass roofs, and they had really low doors that you had to get on your hands and knees and crawl into, and no windows. Well, he's over there living there for a long time and having a good time and working, and until another American came over there who was a typical American who had lots of ideas and good ideas, and this is the way things should be done. And he said, these people, how can you be so backwards? Windows. Ever think of putting windows in your houses? Because they cooked inside their houses, and the smoke inside their houses, the houses were always full of smoke. People had eye problems. It drifted through the thatch. Everything was smoky and sooty. And he said, if you would have windows in your houses, the smoke could get out. I mean, it's not saying everybody's dumb, but it looks pretty dumb not to have windows in your house, something as simple as a window. So they got out there, he got out saws, and they just sawed through the mud and made windows in all the houses. And it was a good idea, great idea. The light came in, the air came in, the smoke went out, everybody was happy. Until the rainy season came, and the mosquitoes came, and all of a sudden these houses, which were sanctuaries when the mosquitoes full of malaria came up out of the swamps at night, were no longer sanctuaries. And the whole village and malaria is a thing you live with in parts of Africa, but you can be reinfected, you can get really sick. Malaria is a terrible, terrible disease. But you can protect yourself from it by protecting your exposure to mosquitoes, especially at night. All the natives who actually knew what they were doing a lot better than the Americans thought, mudded all their windows back shut. Value in traditions that isn't apparent at first glance. At first glance, it looks like these are ridiculous traditions. Of course you should have windows. Fresh air is good. But actually, it was a life-saving thing. Those smoky little houses that are full of smoke with no windows were saving the lives of their children. They didn't know that. I'm not saying all tradition is good. We've seen traditions that are bad, but before you ditch a tradition, before you lay a tradition aside for something better, because you will replace every tradition with another tradition, you should consult the people who started the tradition. Interestingly enough, most of those people are dead. But you can consult dead people, and I'm not, that sounds weird, not like spirits and seances and things like that. But look at why. Read history. Why did they do this? Ask questions. There are wise old people still among us. Learn why before you let something go. Something as simple as Windows, as obviously stupid as Windows, actually was a life-saving tradition. That little low door that you had to crawl through helped keep the house full of smoke. And the smoke saved their lives from the mosquitoes. All of the ways people all across the world, every culture from China to the American Indians, have traditions. And they pass on these traditions to their children. And one of the most effective ways of passing on a tradition, the reason for a tradition and the value of a tradition, is by telling stories. And that's something that Mennonites haven't excelled in. We don't even know our stories often. Some of the old orders, some of the Amish people do a fairly decent job at telling stories and passing on who we are, why we're here. But I think sometimes we've fallen behind. We listen to people. We have heroes. They're all around us. They're in the world. They're on screens in front of us. And we listen to stories, but we're not telling the stories of who we are and why we are here and what we should be doing. Good stories keep alive and keep going centuries, generations, millennia after the teller of the story is gone. We all know the story about the man who set off from Jerusalem to go to Jericho, and there was thieves, and he fell among thieves. We know the story of the Good Samaritan. We know the story of the lady who lost a coin in her house and searched all over to try to find the coin. These stories have power, and they transmit values from generation to generation. Now, today, I want to give you a little lesson in telling stories. And I don't consider myself a very good storyteller. I consider myself someone who loves to tell stories. And I get it wrong a lot of the time, but I actually don't do a very good job. I don't have the right, anyway, but for whatever that's worth. Stories are very effective, and all of you are storytellers. We're born to tell stories. We transmit things by telling stories, and it's all different. Every person tells them differently, but we should be telling stories. We must be telling stories to our children. Stories help us grow. They make us laugh. They make us cry. Good stories teach us, and they pass on something of value. And a lot of you are storytellers. I've heard a lot of stories this weekend, and I encourage you in that. What I would like, my vision for this talk is that you would go home today and tomorrow, and you would tell stories to somebody, to children, little simple stories, stories about your grandpa, stories about growing up, little stories that may not look like they have a deep spiritual truth necessarily, but stories that kind of tell who we are. And then keep on doing this, maybe every night. Keep on doing this and build a culture of stories. Teach your children to tell stories. Storytelling is a culture, and it's a culture that we need to regain. And not that person is a storyteller. No, we're all storytellers. We all have stories, and we bring our stories together, and the stories make us who we are and tell us who we are. And when we know where we came from and who we are, we can get a pretty good idea of the direction that we're supposed to be going. I love, tell me the stories of Jesus. We have the song, and I think of Jesus, and he told stories, and people remembered those stories, and they were the simplest stories. You know, there was a sower, and he went out, and he was sowing his seed, and the birds came, and I'm involved in the story. I think, well, that expensive grass seed, and the birds are eating it, and well, then there's the weeds, and then he talked about the man, and he built his house. There were some men, they were building houses, and one chose a rock, and one chose the sand, and look at how that all worked out. We remember these stories. God created us to tell stories. So, how do you tell stories effectively? And this is not a complete class, but I'm going to give you some principles about telling stories that work nearly every time, especially if you're natured a little bit like me. Not as a good, visual. People tell stories in different ways. I visualize things. I'm not my mind is not an organized place. A story in my mind is a series of pictures, and it's a real thing. A story is a real thing, and every picture goes in order, and all you do when you tell a story is you just go from one picture to the next picture to the next picture to the next, and describe what you're seeing in your mind. And that's why every time you tell it, it can be a little different, no problem, but it's still the same story, and you can tell it effectively. If you try to remember the order of the words, and you're natured like me, you're not going to be able to do a good job. Now, I have an acquaintance who does that very well with the order of the words and tells stories, but I think in pictures, and each picture I describe. Anyway, that's one way to do it. But remember, a story is a real thing. It's something that even if it's fictional, it's something that happened in your mind, and you're just describing something that happened. So, but before I want to tell you a few stories this morning, but before I tell you the first story, I want you to think about listening to stories. Now, it's interesting when we're bombarded with noises and screens, and we turn into not very good listeners to stories. Children know how to listen to stories, especially the children here. The parents who have been raising your children, you've been doing a good job, because they know how to respectfully pay attention and listen to stories. They're amazing. And today I want you to be like children when you listen to these stories. I want you to just sit back. I want you to picture in your mind the things that are happening, and don't be afraid to react. And it's really nice if you let your mouths hang open a little bit and a little drool come out or something, just to know that you're listening. Listen like a child, and you will enjoy stories a lot better. There's something inside of us as an adult that when the story gets right to the good point, it's a really good part, you just want to lean back and kind of look over at your neighbor and not just keep listening to the story. I want you to follow the story through. And when you do that, you'll become a better teller of stories. So, there's a story, old story, from the middle of Africa, and it's about a little girl and a little boy. And they had a problem. The girl was about 7 years old, and the boy was about 9 years old. And their problem was very common to little boys and girls. Their problem was that they fought. And they fought badly. They bit and they scratched and they slapped, and they said things like "Du bist ein Dummkopf," but they said that in Swahili or something else. And they weren't friends even remotely. Well, the little girl, time goes on, and her big brother, and they just fight, and it's getting worse, and she decides, I need to do something. This fighting business is not some way that I want to live for the rest of my life. So she decided she needed some help, some outside help. So she walked across the little village, and she came to where the old wise man of the village lived, who was old and very wise. His beard was long, white as snow. His eyebrows were so long and thick that you could hardly see his eyes underneath. And he sat outside his little hut made of grass, and he drank tea with honey, and he thought wise things, and he gave people wise advice. And the little girl came to him and said, "Old man, I have a problem." And he said, "Well, what's your problem?" As he drank his tea, and she said, "Well, I have a brother, and he's a problematic child, and we fight, and I'm tired of fighting. We need to fix the problem." And the old man said, well, what do you propose to do in fixing the problem? She said, well, she's heard of a magic medicine that if you give it to this problem person and they take it, they'll all of a sudden be nice. No more meanness, no more grumpiness, and they'll just love other people and no more fighting. And the old man thought for a little bit and sipped a little more of his tea, and he said, you know what I need from you, little girl? I need you to go into the jungle, and I need you to find a lion, a living lion, and I need you to bring me 3 whiskers from the lips of that living lion. And the little girl thought she must have heard wrong. She said, do you know about lions? Lions eat little girls just like you would eat popcorn. And the old man said, well, if you do get eaten by the lion, you won't have any more problems with your brother, will you? And the little girl, she had a little tantrum. She wasn't very mature. She stomped a little, but she went home. And when she got home, she had another fight with her brother, and she said, this isn't working. I may as well give it a try. So she went to her refrigerator, opened the door, and inside there was some chicken, delicious chicken that had been grilled by her dad the night before, tasty, aromatic, and she took it in her hand, a piece, and went into the jungle. Now, I'm sure some of you have been in jungles. A jungle is actually a terrifying place. You have a high canopy that is so thick that the sunlight can hardly make it through. Underneath the trees, it's always kind of a half-light, a dingy darkness. And in the half-light, there roam a lot of animals. And the one thing in common with most jungle animals is that either they want to bite you and hurt you, or they want to eat you. And it can be snakes big enough to swallow you, spiders big enough to catch small birds, and even the occasional undernourished child in their webs. There can be, in this particular jungle, there's tigers and wolves and wolverines and a lot of really spooky animals. And they're all in there thinking about their next meal. So the little girl, she walks into the jungle and she hears the noises of the jungle around her in the darkness, and there's the hissing of the snakes and the growling of undetermined animals in the undergrowth, and in the distance she can hear the roars of lions. She goes deeper and deeper and deeper in the jungle. It gets darker and darker until she comes to a place in the jungle where there are no trees. And it's about the size of this room. The grass is short and green. The trees are a ring around it, and there's a shaft of sunlight coming through the top, the opening in the canopy, and the grass is warm and inviting. And lying on the other side of the clearing, in the grass, is a lion, a huge lion, and it's sound asleep. The little girl thinks to herself, now's my chance. I'll creep across the clearing in my bare feet, as quiet as a mouse. I'll come up to the lion while he's sleeping, pop out his whiskers, and be done. Very brave. So she starts walking across the clearing, a chicken in one hand, careful as can be, her little bare feet pressing down on the grass. She makes about the same amount of noise as smoke makes when it drifts through the trees, which is not very much noise. And she's about halfway across the clearing when her little bare foot steps down on a stick, about the size of a matchstick, and it breaks. It makes about the same amount of noise that a fly would make if it coughed, which is not very much noise. But lions, even when they're asleep and their eyes and their mouths are shut and they're snoring, keep their ears wide open. And somehow that lion heard the snap of that stick and woke up. And the first thing he saw was the little girl right in front of him. He looked up, the little girl froze, his eyes were open, gigantic lion eyes, golden and flecked with little flecks of something, opened his gigantic lion mouth with teeth longer than your longest fingers, looked at that girl right in the eyes, and roared so loud that the leaves fell off the trees. The little girl turned, she dropped her chicken, she turned and she ran as if her life depended on it, which it assuredly did. And she ran so fast that sometimes when she came to a tree, instead of going around it like you or I would do, she jumped right over the top. She ran so fast that the lion didn't catch her and didn't eat her. Mainly because it stopped when it smelled that delicious chicken and paused long enough to eat that and let her get away. Well, she finally made it back to her yard, safe and sound. Nothing was missing. She was delighted with that. And the next day came around, and she had another fight with her brother, and she thought, you know what? Last time went okay. Let's try it again. So she went to the refrigerator again, another piece of chicken, into the forest. Same clearing. There lies the lion, but this time he's awake, and he's waiting for her. And when she comes into the clearing, he sees her right away. He picks his head up, and he licks his lips. She's brave. She walks out in the middle. She puts the chicken in the grass, and she turns, and she walks away and goes back home. Next day, she gets another piece of chicken, and she goes a little closer, puts the chicken in the grass, goes back home. She keeps doing this day after day after day after day until finally one day, she walks right up to the lion, holds out the piece of chicken. The lion opens up its gigantic lion mouth, reaches out its gigantic lion tongue, and she realizes that lions very infrequently brush their teeth. Its breath smelled very meaty. Grabbed the piece of chicken, swallowed it in one gulp, and while it was swallowing and licking its lips, she reached her hand over, pulled out 3 whiskers, put them in her pocket, patted the lion on the nose, and went back to the old man, who was sitting there still drinking his tea and thinking wise thoughts. And she said to him, old man, I'm back." And he said, "Who are you, and where have you been?" And she said, "Well, I'm the little girl, and I went and got the lion whiskers." And he said, "Did you get them?" "Yes," she said, "I have them right here in my pocket." And the old man said, "How in the world did you do that?" And so she told him. She got the chicken, and she went, and he roared, and the leaves fell down, and she ran, and she came back, and she tried again, and how the lion never brushed his teeth, but she got the whiskers anyway, and here they are. And the old man said, "Wow, that's quite a story." And then he didn't say anything more, and he kept drinking his tea. And she said, "Well, are you gonna get me the magic medicine?" He said, in all his experience, which admittedly isn't exhaustive, but in all of his experience, he's never heard of a magic medicine like that. And the little girl said, "Well, what am I supposed to do then?" And he said, "Well, if you go home and you treat your brother the same way you treated that lion, with gentleness and kindness like that day after day, very likely you can make a friendship with him as well." Not what the little girl wanted to hear. In her immaturity, she stomped a little, and she had a wee bit of a tantrum, which she shouldn't have had. But she went home. There was her brother in all his aggravating glory. And she thought, you know what, might as well give it a try. So she went again to the refrigerator, which, interestingly enough, most really good things in life start with a refrigerator. Opened the door, and she pulled out ingredients, chocolate chips and butter and flour, probably not in the fridge, different odds and ends. I'm not even sure of all the ingredients. She mixed them up. She was a very mature 7-year-old, and she made a batch of chocolate chip cookies, and she baked them, and they were deliciously perfect. Brown and soft a little on the inside, the middle, but the outside was a little crunchy, and they just smelled, and there was a little extra butter involved, and it was just really a nice situation. She filled a cup full of milk and put that in the middle of a plate full of cookies, and she carried that into her brother's room, where he was sitting there on his bed studying his Sunday school lesson. And he saw her come in and raised his grumpy face. She put the cookies on the table and said, "These are for you, my brother, because I like you." Little sisters can be a little aggravating sometimes. And he looked up at her, all grumpy and angry, and said to her, "Shut up and get out of my room!" But did she jump? No. She'd been roared at by lions. She said, "Bye-bye, my brother." And she walked out of the room. And there he sat doing his Sunday school lesson, trying to focus on the Sunday school lesson. But he kept smelling the smells of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. And finally, he just ate all of them up very quickly, which is generally how boys eat cookies. Took the milk and drank it. Glug, 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 glug. Delicious. And his belly was happy, and he had warm thoughts to his sister. Well, time goes on. Every day she does something else nice to him. And one day he comes to her and says, "You know, sister, I've been thinking. And you probably haven't thought of this as immature as you are, but as an elder brother, I think I should take a little responsibility in this area. It feels like we haven't always had the best relationship, and it feels like we should maybe change that, and we should have more of a friendly brother and sister friendship instead of this constant animosity." Little girl was very wise in that she knew that men generally like to think that they thought of all the good ideas themselves. And she said, "That's a good idea. I'm so impressed. I think we should start that right now." And so they did, and they tried. And it wasn't always easy, and sometimes they fought a little bit. But they learned that it was a lot more fun to be friends than it was to fight. And it was a friendship that was formed through little acts of kindness. And even things as terrifying as lions and as intractable as older brothers who are always right and don't respect you can be won over with gentleness and kindness, constantly, day by day. A soft answer turns away wrath. Be thoughtful of your audience. Good stories help us face our fears. They help us give courage to do impossible things that God will ask of us. The best stories make us think of Jesus. When I tell stories to children of other nationalities that don't have the groundwork of our heritage, our culture here in America, I try to remember to explain all the little things they probably won't understand. Very good for you as a storyteller to remember that. Your children are young. Explain the words they don't know. Maybe even explain them before you get to the story. Why in the world the ladies in Africa would go down to the river for their water when they should just go to the kitchen sink. Well, maybe it's because they don't have kitchen sinks. In a lot of places in the world, they don't have kitchen sinks. Familiarize your listeners before you start so you don't have to interrupt your story later. One of the really frustrating things as you begin telling stories and you tell stories more and more is when your story is just rolling along and doing great and you're really in the spirit of things and you're starting to have a little bit of sweat on your forehead and your children are their eyes are starting to get really big, and then something happens to kind of break your story. And that can be a question. It can be 100 different things, a chair falling over. And it's really easy for a storyteller to become frustrated. And when I'm telling you a story, you sit and listen and no words. Be graceful and gentle when you're telling stories and let children ask. Let them be a part of it. It's about them learning. And one of the things that can break your story is poor planning on you telling it, but that'll get better and better as you tell it more. Sometimes you forget a detail, and wait, hold on. Before we're here, we should go back and redo this detail. Try to plan out your stories a little bit so you don't forget the important details, but that'll come with practice. Be graceful and kind to the people of your story. One of the most effective uses for stories is to point out wrong things and failings in other people. Nathan did this to King David. He came to him and he told him a simple story about sheep and about sin and about greed. And David, he heard the message of the story, and he changed his life. This is an amazing art. It's an amazing thing you can do with stories, but it's very delicate. Your goal when you tell stories is always to build God's kingdom and with a heart of love help your audience, whoever they are, to become more and better and closer to God than they were before. And not every story has to have a moral. You can have stories that are about fighting something greater than yourself, about courage, about facing your fears. Stories, but your stories should point you back to Jesus at some point. A lot of your stories, because remember, we're trying to pass on something of value. We're trying to build the kingdom of God. Never tell stories to hurt and belittle. Never tell stories to make yourself look like a hero and someone else look like a loser. Once upon a time, and this story is absolutely true, when I was a little boy, this is one of my favorite stories. It's a story about a haunted pig barn, and about a fearless mountain man, and about bears, and about Candyland. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever played Candyland. Is that a game that you have played before? Isn't it like the most awful game in the whole world? So I played Candyland with my sister, and when I was 5 years old, we're playing Candyland, and all is going well except my sister is always winning. And which is frustrating when you're 5 and your sister's like 7 and she's kind of not making it very easy for you. Well, one day we're playing, it's evening, and I'm in my pajamas, we're getting ready for bed, but we're playing Candyland, and my sister is winning it as normal. But this time I draw the right cards, and I'm within spitting distance of the celestial city or whatever it is there at the end. And I drew, instead of something that could get me farther, I drew the peppermint forest, which in our Candyland game was back at the very beginning. It was basically the card that said, go back to start, you're done for, this is the end for you, give up. Well, I tried to slip the card back in. My sister saw it was not a nice situation, and she said to me, now be a good sport, Aaron. And I did the only thing I could do as a fearless mountain man and a man of honor. I stood up, I threw the card down on the board, and I said, that's it. I'm going to run away from home, and I'm never going to come back. And my dad was sitting right there in the recliner, and he looks at me and he says, you know, Aaron, that's actually a pretty good idea. Maybe you should start right now. That was my plan, Dad. Thanks. Out the door I went, underneath the pecan trees, and I had a plan. I was going to go into the forest and build myself a house of sticks and leaves and branches, a comfortable little house, far away from everyone. I was going to kill a bear, make myself new clothes instead of these kind of sissy little pajamas, and I was going to live there happily and never ever come back and visit my family, who were actually kind of a bunch of jerks. And but it was evening, and it was a little easing toward dark, and even a fearless mountain man doesn't want to just go off in the woods right before dark. We have our limits, and I decided to run across the fields instead to my neighbor's house, who had a barn, and it was about a mile away, a barn and a hayloft, and in the hayloft would be some hay, and I would just spend the night there, safe from the bears, and live there for the night until the morning when I could go into the forest. Well, I ran underneath the pecan trees and through the pine trees and around the grain bin, and I forgot about my path. I forgot that it went right past the door to the haunted pig barn. Now, I don't know if any of you have had any experience at all with a haunted pig barn. Haunted pig barns are truly awful things. They're big, they have no windows, they have a door, and inside an abandoned haunted pig barn there are many things that live. I'm not even sure what they all are, but they're big and they're scary. There are bones on the floor of a haunted pig barn. There are bats in the ceiling. And these things that live in a haunted pig barn are just waiting for an opportunity, usually in the dusk, night time of things, to reach their hands out the door and grab a passersby and eat him. I knew there was no way I was going to go past this door that was open with the darkness oozing out. I had to come up with another plan, plan B. Well, mountain men generally have a plan B. My plan B was to take a hard right, go down the road, it's about 3/4 of a mile, to another one of our neighbor's house. The road was there. First it was a field, then a deep ditch, then the road, and then a big forest. I was going to run along the ditch on the field side all the way to my neighbor's house, who had a sailboat in the yard. And I thought, I'll go into the sailboat. I'll spend the night in the sailboat where I'll be safe and dry and safe from the bears. And in the morning I'll head off into the woods and make myself a house of sticks and leaves and branches and never ever come home or even visit my family. So I ran, and it was in the evening, and the sun had set, but it was still light, and it was warm. It was summertime. It was wonderful. Running away was wonderful. I would have probably had to be in bed already if I'd have been at home, but here I was, a mountain man, free from all the constraints, and I ran all the way across the fields until I came right to my neighbor's property, but I had forgotten that a ditch had made a corner there, and flowed between me and the neighbor. Now, some of you know about the ditches back in that part of North Carolina. The swamp has been drained not that many years ago with dredges. And some of these ditches are 30 feet deep, full of mud and water, crocodiles, turtles, poisonous snakes, things you can hardly even imagine that live down in the mud, that like nothing better than grabbing little children and pulling them underneath where they can enjoy them. And I knew even a brave mountain man has no place crossing a ditch like that, especially in the dusk. So I contemplated that for a little bit, and I decided it was time to move on from plan B to plan C. So I turned around to head back to our Indian camp that we'd made in our pine trees. But when I turned around and I looked back the way I had come, somehow, as I was running away and getting away from home and all that stuff, bears had woken up in the dark in the evening and crossed over the road in the ditch from the forest, and now they were in the field. Not just one, not just 10, dozens of bears. And they were all looking at me. Some of them were licking their lips. They were especially dangerous bears because they were so intelligent. And I knew they were intelligent because they were all standing along the ditch banks pretending to be clumps of weeds. But I knew they weren't clumps of weeds, even though they moved a little in the breeze. They were intelligent, hungry bears looking for their supper. Well, brave mountain men never cry. Something they don't do. But sometimes they run so fast that the wind blowing in their eyes makes their eyes water. That's what happened to me. I ran, the wind blew, my eyes watered like crazy, and I had to make little whooping noises as I ran because exhaustion and all those kind of things. I ran right past the bears, and not one of them ate me, which was good. Got back to our yard, to our Indian camp, where we had a little teepee made of sticks, and I crawled into the little teepee, and I curled up for the night, safe from the bears. By now it's dark, and as I lay there in the darkness, relaxing after that near catastrophe, something even worse than the bears came and found me. And it wasn't alone. And when it came, it sang a song that sounded like this. Hundreds of them. In North Carolina, I don't know how it is here, in the deep swamps, we have mosquitoes that are gigantic. If you leave a pet or a small child or even a stuffed animal outside overnight, sometimes in the morning when you go and try to get them, there's nothing left but a skin and some rattly bones inside. I was in danger, great danger. I knew my only hope was to light a fire, and I knew do. Indians, for centuries, have used rocks, banging rocks together to make a cozy fire in the evening. We don't have rocks there in Pantego, but we do have concrete, and there were some chunks of concrete there in the Indian camp, which I proceeded to build a fire with. Banged them together in every conceivable configuration. Let me tell you, boys, something. You survival people, that whole theory of banging rocks together to make a fire is baloney. Doesn't work. Not even a spark. Finally, I had to abandon camp and went on to another plan, which involved our little shed full of junk. It was a shed, maybe, it was not that super big, but it was full of junk. It had old weed eaters and wheelbarrows that never worked or pushed or ran. And then there was an old lawnmower, riding lawnmower that never actually rode. It just stood there with all its tires flat on the bottom. And I sat there on the seat of the lawnmower, safe from all the things outside, and I pretended to drive the lawnmower, and all was well in my new place until the mosquitoes followed me there. Well, now I was running low on options. What do I do now? And I finally saw my dad's pickup truck, and I thought, you know what? That would be a safe place for the night. I'll camp in the pickup truck. In the morning, before my dad goes to work, I'll wake up, head off into the forest. The bears will be asleep by then. Build myself a house, never come home, all of those wonderful things. So I went over to my dad's pickup. I opened the door, and the little light came on, and I climbed into the seat behind the steering wheel. Shut the door, the little light went off, and I just sat there in the darkness, all the mosquitoes lined up on the window outside. I just laughed at them. And then, while I was sitting there in peace and quiet in the pickup, getting ready to plan my night, the door of our house opened, and a stream of light came out from the inside of the house, and my dad came out. He had a flashlight. He closed the door, and he shone the flashlight all around the yard. I just put my head down a little bit. Didn't see me. He walked out underneath the pecan trees, through the pine trees, around the grain bin, and I knew I'd never see my dad again, because that was the direction to the haunted pig barn. Bye, Dad. It's been a good 5 years. But then, before long, he came back, and I realized that my dad was even tougher than whatever lived in that old pig barn. But he also didn't find me back there. And then he shone his flashlight down along the road, along the trees, through the bean fields, over toward my neighbor's house. Shone for a long time. He even walked that direction a little bit. But guess what? He didn't find me there. Then he went over to the pine trees where our Indian camp was, and our little teepee and everything there, my fire lighting area. And he shone all around there in the teepee, and the little teepee. But he didn't find me there either. And then he went over to our junk little shed, looked in the junk shed there, right on the lawnmower. But he didn't find me there either. Then he turned and looked at his pickup truck. And he walked over to the door, and he shone his light in at me. And I looked up at him. He opened up the door, and he said to me, "Scoot over." So I scooted over. Then he sat down beside me, shut the door, and the little light went off. And he just stood there and sat there in the dark for a long time, looking out of the windshield into the darkness in front of him. And I sat there in the darkness, looking up at him. Well, time went on, and we started to talk. And we talked about bears, and we talked about haunted pig barns, and we talked about fields full of stubble that hurt your feet, deep ditches. We talked about mosquitoes. We talked about sisters. And we talked about Candyland. And we talked about being a good sport. We talked about a lot of things there in the dark. Finally, I said to my dad, "You know, Dad, I've been thinking, and I wonder if it would be okay if I would just stop running away and came back home and lived there again." And my dad looked at me and he said, "You know, he thinks that would be a good idea." So we got out of the truck, and I held my dad's hand, and we walked back into the house, and I lived there. And I never, ever ran away again. I learned that sometimes the problems out there, when we run from our problems here, we find worse problems out there. But I also learned that when the problems got really bad, I had a home that I could come back to and a Father who came and looked for me. Let's not forget to tell our stories. You are the keepers of your children's future. You're the keepers of the stories that will tell your children who they are, that will help them remember whose they are. Stories that will pass on a faith that is living, and stories that will show everyone around us the way back home. God bless you.